Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you join us from. A very warm welcome here from the Center for Global Studies. If you don't know me, I'm Oliver Schmidtke. I'm director of the Center for Global Studies, and today we have the great fortune to be treated to showing of a documentary, Cuba in between or between hurricanes. And we also have the great pleasure of having the director of the documentary, Michael Shannon, and the co-director, Gina Stubbs, here with us. And I'm very grateful that they took out the time joining us from Europe for today's session. So before we go and introduce the speakers and we go to the showing, let me just start by acknowledging, with respect, the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Visanj peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. And although we are meeting in a virtual environment, I think it's important to acknowledge the legacy of colonialism. We just had a major incident here in Canada that made headlines around the world that highlighted again what the legacy of colonial rule is for the Indigenous people of Canada. And I think recognizing that we are part here of this system and that we are situated in the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples is an important part of what UVic and the Center for Global Studies in particular intends to do. With this, let me start introducing first Michael Shannon, who is a documentary filmmaker, writer, and emeritus professor of film and video at Roehampton University in London. And he began his film career making documentaries mostly on avant-garde classical music for BBC Two. And I understand, Michael, that this interest and passion for music has stayed with you, but you have also ventured off into politics and different types of filmmaking, both as a writer, but also as someone directing these documentary, mainly focused on Latin America cinema, but also, then focusing on Cuban cinema as a particular interest. And since the 1980s, Michael has filmed in most countries of the continent in Latin America, including Cuba. We will see evidence of this in a second. Over the past 20 years, most of Michael's films have been found great academic and public acknowledgement. And some of those projects, film projects, include Interrupted Memory, a film about political memory in Argentina and Chile, and Money Puzzles, about the bewildering nature of money, as well, films focusing on Detroit and the city of London. And Michael is currently working on a book about cultural commodification and creative labor. I suppose the COVID context has given you also new thoughts on this topic, and completing a film about family history. And as I said, he is the director of the documentary that we're going to watch in a couple of minutes. And then it is a great pleasure of welcoming back Gina Stubbs to the Center for Global Studies. She has been with us twice, so yeah, it's wonderful to see, although it has far too long that you've been out here on the West Coast. Gina is the founding co-director of the Commodities of Empire British Academy Research Project, and she's an associate fellow at the Institute of Latin American Studies at the University of London, and also the professor emerita of London Metropolitan University, where she directed the Caribbean Studies Center. Jean has served as president of the Regional Caribbean Studies Association and the chair of the UK Society for Caribbean Studies, and she's a member of the Cuban Academy of History, so a strong ties and strong relationship with Cuba. And when you hear her, and we'll call upon her in a second, you understand much of her research interest has been related to Cuba, looking at issues of tobacco, labor, gender, race, migration. So with this background, with a scholarly background, I'm sure she has been quite fascinated by thinking about a different kind of way of showing life, society, challenges in Cuba. And Gene, with this, I would like to invite you, before we show the documentary, to share with us some insights into what actually led to the film. If you could just give us a sense of the background and what led to the actual project, and how your also maybe scholarly interest intersect with a different kind of format of reflecting on social life in Cuba. With this, Jean, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Oliver. And it's a real pleasure to be back, even though at a distance. Yeah, this project came about because for a number of years now on the Commodities of Empire project, a group of us had been really concerned about how you meld commodity history and environmental history. And we were also concerned about how the body of research that we were observing across the network of scholars working on the project, how that research could be made more available to a wider public. A colleague, close colleague on the project, Jonathan Curry Machado, who was the co-producer, a historian also like myself, we said, well, how about starting with Cuba? And then Hurricane Irma made landfall in a small coastal town of northern Cuba, north central Cuba, called Kaibarin. And we said, right, this is our entree, our point of departure. We will go in and film, but we want to look at how over history, as well as in the present, commodities, environment, climate change, hurricanes in specific, have impacted on the region. And as we progressed, and Michael can take this up from a visual point of view, but what was going to be living with hurricanes became living between hurricanes, because it was a lot about what a country does that knows that it's going to be hit by hurricanes a lot.
Thank you, Jean. And Michael, Jean gave you already the cue here, inviting you to reflect on the artistic project of producing a documentary on complex issues, like living with or between hurricanes. Michael, if you can invite you to share some thoughts on this before we actually come to the showing of the documentary.
Thank you, Oliver. Briefly, let me say first, if I may, you mentioned that I started out making films on classical music, BBC Two, avant-garde music, and then moved to other things. I just want to say, actually, they were there together for me at the beginning. The second film I made for BBC was with Pierre Boulez, who was then conductor of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and it was about why he wanted to take conventional concerts out into non-conventional venues, and we called it The Politics of Music. Okay. When I first filmed in Cuba in the 1980s, and one of the films that I made there, Jean worked on with me as the researcher. Those were big budget, television budget films made through institutional support or with the help of the Film Institute. Of course, I knew the Film Institute very well because the first thing I'd done on getting to Cuba, which was 1979, was to write a history of Cuban cinema. And the prospect of filming this in 2019 was the first big contrast, because academic budgets are very small. You're not working with a big professional crew. You're working with perhaps, with local people, a very small crew, much in the same way as any independent filmmaker in Cuba. When you say, when you ask how I visualized it or whatever, it isn't, of course, just a question of visualization. It's a question of organizing an exposition of some kind. And what happens in documentary is, certainly if you're working collaboratively, and in this case, that was not only among ourselves, we were working with an NGO in Cuba dedicated to the environment, and with the help of the people at the Cinemateca. And so you start with a treatment or indeed some kind of script, but you know you're going to depart from it. However, in so far as visualization might be taken just a little bit more narrowly, what I did know from the beginning was that it was not only a question of filming in a particular locale, but also we wanted the historical sweep, and that immediately said to me, newsreel. And there's been a weekly newsreel in Cuba since the revolution. And so immediate recourse to find that history buried within those newsreels was part of the scheme, the visual scheme of the film for me from the very beginning.
Wonderful. And I'm sure people are now very curious to actually see, the film. So what we've decided, and we checked out, how it would work to show the film on Zoom, that we lose some of the quality. So Stephanie is going to put a link into the chat box with a way to link you directly to Vimeo, where you can watch the movie in higher quality. And what we suggest doing is that you go there and watch the movie in high quality, and that we reconvene in 70 minutes. The movie is 1 hour, 8 minutes long or so, so that we reconvene at 11:25 for the Q&A session. So that gives us a little bit of time. So if you could copy the address of the X to Vimeo from the chat and then watch it yourself, and then come back, please join us for the Q&A session after the showing. So I hope that works for you. I think that Stephanie will also put up a slide. We leave this room open, but I think it's safer and of higher quality if you go to directly to Vimeo. So with this, I would suggest we see each other in an hour and 10 minutes at 11:25. Congratulations on this film. Really, it touches you, in particular if you're a bit familiar with Cuba, and you realize the tremendous challenges this island has seen. And I think, as one gentleman put it, it's a situation spéciale, so special situation. I can only imagine what it means now, even compounded by the COVID crisis, the lack of tourism. And if you put together the environmental challenges together with the unstable socioeconomic situation in Cuba, you really sometimes feel quite concerned about the country's future, but maybe we can discuss this as well. I'm not sure who wants to start. I have one question here, I think, from Beate, who will have to leave soon. Maybe we can start with this. Let me read out Beate's question. Sorry, I need to leave soon. I want to ask a question. Let me thank first for sharing your documentary. Having been to Cuba myself several times, I could relate to the environmental, social issues that you've masterfully depict. I'm wondering whether Cuba is part of a Caribbean strategy to address some of the consequences of climate change. Does Cuba collaborate with its neighbor or international organizations on this front, or is basically collaborating on this? Is Cuba on its own and in terms of trying to mitigate and address some of the environmental challenges? Knowledge sharing, resources. I'm not sure whether there's any alliances that Cuba has built in trying to coordinate attempts across different islands in the Caribbean. I'm not sure whether you're aware of any of that.
Well, I can come in since I'm in the midst of the Caribbean Studies Association meeting right now. And following what's going on in Cuba, I mean, we couldn't have imagined when we filmed the unforeseen developments after, right? As you will have seen from the documentary, the tourism was absolutely uppermost. It was its latest commodity frontier, if you want. And poof, it was gone with COVID. So how is the island going to survive? The economic situation there is very bad right now. Food security is threatened, et cetera, et cetera. But Cuba does collaborate very closely with international organizations like the United Nations or and the development wing of the United Nations, or their environmental part, with Latin American regional bodies as well, and Caribbean bodies. It's just had funding for 27 different settlements around Cuba, precisely to address coastal erosion, problems of the nature that we were dealing with in Kaibarin. Sadly, Kaibarin is not one of those. So that locality is not going to benefit in that sense. But the irony, Oliver, is that Cuba has an exemplary national policy on environmental conservation. The latest iteration of that is Tarea Vida, which is mentioned in the documentary and dates back to 2017. In fact, it was just before we were filming that it was being rolled out. It tops the Global Sustainable Development Index that was developed here in the UK, but it tops it from a position of shortage and low carbon emissions because of that. So it's a very kind of paradigmatic case in that respect. But what we wanted to find out was how it affects the localities in Cuba. And hence why we went in through the municipality. And to be honest, it was a very sad story of this little town that had seen far better days and that was sidelined by the tourism on the Keys. So Michael, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, not at the moment. That seems to be a very fair summary.
And that's, it's an impressive story of this one city that within decades has seen, so much change, right? And as described, it seems, from times of relative glory, to a forgotten place, that is battered by environmental and economic challenges, right? With the change in the industry. And I think what you did masterfully in this movie is to relate environmental changes, right? And how it transforms the reality on the ground, what is being produced, how the local economy adapts to it, and which parts of Cuba flourish, whereas others have been largely forgotten, right? And that's clearly we see Cuba reacts to these environmental challenges, and hurricanes probably the most dramatic iteration of that.
Yeah.
I think there's another element in that as well, which is that the Cuba that we're showing is not the Cuba that people are used to seeing. Not only because the Cuba people are used to seeing, comes through the mass media, more or less, but also because it distorts the sense of what Cuba is, because it's concentrated on Havana. And Havana isn't Cuba the same way New York isn't the United States or London isn't Britain. There's a story behind that, because what we hit in Kaibarin was a kind of disconnect between the center, the policy, including policies like Tarea Vida, and the reality on the ground, which is one of very uneven and unequal development, among other things, for the kind of reasons that the film does explore.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. Most tourists would go to Havana and then to Varadero, I guess, you know, the kind of sheltered tourist part, you know, for the seaside resorts, right? And yeah, and that's also then tells you something about the benefit that comes from tourism and where it lands. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the irony, of course, for Kaibarin is that it's right next to one of the most recent resort areas on the Keys. And what makes it very difficult is that when there's talk about policies for the municipality of Kaibarin, it includes the Keys. So in effect, the policies are for the Keys, they're not for the city. And they're not for its restoration in the way that Havana's had Old Havana or Trinidad, or even nearby Remedios, which has been given resources, but Kaibarin hasn't.
Could I let me, you know, see in the chat box, Nicole. Nicole, are you still see the? All right, do you want to start your mic? I think the cameras can't be, or maybe you can.
Oh,
Nicole,
yeah,
maybe. Great. Okay, go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks. Thank you both. That was really interesting. Sorry, I typed this. I didn't realize I could talk. So I just got back online, but I heard Jean mention about kind of the exemplary policies around the environment and sustainability that Cuba's had. And I'm wondering how they might balance this going forward with their reliance on tourism. You know, especially as you so well, I mean, I really appreciated the point showing the all-inclusive or whatever that was with all the food and you know, so they're, you know, if how do they balance this policy, but also maybe you know, a philosophy and a culture around Pura Vida and the expanding or reliance on tourism?
Right now, there's an enormous debate about that. Obviously, the tourism ministry wants to get back to tourism as it was, and they've put a lot of money and resources into trying to make the tourist resorts COVID safe. You know, they introduced a two-pronged policy or two-track whereby the international tourists would go onto the Keys and they would be very heavily monitored health-wise and wouldn't spread on the island. But then they moved away from that, and the result was that during all of the months this year, they've had more COVID cases than in the whole of last year. So there was a resurgence. And the economists, the environmentalists, they're all saying, we can't go back to this. And we have to have a different kind of model. And it can't be foreign investment led, which means tourism led at the moment. It has to look internally at food security in particular, and developing the internal economy. And I mean, Michael might want to tell the story of how at one point, after being frustrated filming in Kaibarin, the possibility came up of filming the reforestation and the organic farm, which is in the third part. And at least we felt, oh, well, at least we have a positive story to tell, you know? But it's a very complex reality in that sense.
I think I would want to say that in all the discussion of tourism as an international industry, it's easy to forget that there's also domestic tourism, which is actually potentially, and in some places, larger than international tourism. And if you put that in the context of the complete collapse of international travel worldwide, and the fact that it's not going to recover, certainly not very quickly, and who wants it to recover, then me that any policy for the regeneration of tourism in Cuba ought to concentrate, of course, on domestic tourism. But that depends on all these other factors, which are represented in the economic crisis, the crisis of food, the whole problem of having to import so much supplies, and so forth. So, you know, I wouldn't like to be in the shoes of the policymakers at the moment. Well, in Cuba or anywhere else for that matter.
Thanks, Michael. Maybe, you know, a related question that is not on tourism, but it was quite notable when I was last in Cuba some years ago. You know, the expansion of local farms, you know, local gardens, local food production, and you have this in your documentary, right? You know, so examples of more organically oriented, community-based, place-based farms that use also the, you know, the quite large farms, you know, that used to produce sugar and so forth. Do you see this as a viable strategy, you know, to address in particular shortages? You know, I'm not too surprised to hear that this is now again the case in Cuba. You know, Cuba has gone through different periods in which there was real, you know, real shortage of food. I'm just wondering whether this kind of more community-based, small-scale farming could be at least one of the strategies to ensure that there is enough food on the island, and that also employment, meaningful employment.
The quick answer to that is it has to be.
Right. Yeah. You speak like a good policymaker, though, Michael. You should.
But the longer answer is, of course, much more complicated. One of the really worrying developments of the last year has been that they've turned to expanding GM foods. And again, you know, the environmentalists are up in arms. They're a minority, of course, and they're up against an economic reality of how do you feed the people. And, you know, I've just come from a session in the Caribbean Studies Association where, you know, in the case of Guyana, it's there, what are we going to do? We have to have the oil because we need it to develop, quote unquote. And Cuba is the same with its tourism, but it's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Because the tourism, so much investment has gone into tourism from the national level, as well as the international investment, that so little has gone into agriculture, with the result that 70% of the foodstuff is imported. So it's a huge uphill battle. I'm told that Fernando, who's in the film, he's sort of become a star these days on television, you know, because he's trying to roll out that you can do it. And it's not that farm, they didn't have it handed to them. It was poor soil. There was no water. They had to dig down and get it. And, you know, it was that sheer perseverance of trying to turn it around.
Thank you. Nicole, can we come back to you? You know, you have another question.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. I mean, I don't know exactly how I'm going to formulate this, but I will just start by saying that I'm looking at the intersections between climate change and human mobility in my own PhD work with Oliver. So I'm really kind of cautious or skeptical of this idea that, or this framing and this narrative around climate change drives migration, because one of the things I think the film does very well is point out how connected, like, communities and societies that are based on agriculture, their economy is so tightly tied to the environment. You can't really say this is economic migration and that is climate migration. You know, it's all part of several factors that affect why people move. But I had seen in the write-up to the film and the quote from the president saying, you know, climate change has affected even our migratory processes. So I'm wondering if you came across, I'm thinking it's internal, or if you came across this in your research or in speaking with people who were tired of living on the East Coast, or after the 2017 season, people moved away from the coast, or if there was any kind of movement of people where they directly related it to the kind of increasing storms, or the frequency, or not the frequency, the intensity of hurricanes. And that also makes me think, this reliance on tourism in spaces that are increasingly susceptible to very intense storms is perhaps a problematic investment, in terms of thinking, what are those storms going to look like in another 20 years, and where are people going to be living, or how much damage is going to be done every fall when they rip through that area. So those are just kind of thoughts that I had, but I wanted to kind of pick out the displacement or the movement of people in response to these events, or if that came up. Thanks. Sorry for monopolizing question.
No worries, Nicole.
No. Okay, if I kick in, Michael?
Yes, although let me just say one thing quickly, which is that I'm aware that there are moments in the film when I wish we could have included some other piece of relevant information. One of those is that Kaibarin actually has experienced a very high level of emigration. And that would have helped to put it into perspective. Although I think you're right about not being able to distinguish between economic emigration or climate emigration. And the patterns are different all over the Caribbean.
Yeah. I mean, that's the huge question of the chicken and the egg, isn't it? Because looking at some of the moments over time, in terms of commodity and environment, that we could then move to mobility, was it, the succession of 3 major hurricanes in the 1840s that changed the nature of Cuban agriculture and gave rise to nationalism, or was it other factors? So we could look at historical coincidence, but it's much harder to think about historical causality. And I think the same happens with migration. The migration, I think if you ask most people, what's it due to? They'll say, oh, it's because the town is run down, or it's because we have very close proximity with the US. We have very porous borders because of the Keys. I'm not so sure people would necessarily link it directly to climate change per se, except that they are now being told in some instances that they have to move internally. So when Michael mentioned the high rate of emigration, it's abroad, right? And it's mainly to the US, although it's also to Spain. But Tarea Vida is about moving settlements inland. And some settlements some have been moved. Some are okay with it, the smaller ones, they have new housing built. But somewhere like Kaibarin, they're kind of, they want their town back the way they once knew it, or at least the older people do.
Any questions at the moment? Let's see, we have another 10 minutes or so. If not at the moment, Michael, can I ask you, I got curious about, you sort of mentioned and pointed out the newsreel from the 60s and 70s. How did you get a hands on that? Well, how difficult was it? Were there archives where you could? I'm just a very technical question, but I really admired how you weaved the original footage into current interviews, and it was very well done. But I'm just wondering, how easily was it accessible, all this material that you used?
Well, it was totally accessible to me, in the sense that, first of all, as a historian of Cuban cinema, I knew a lot of material. I knew that the newsreels contained all sorts of material, though the number of newsreels I'd actually seen over the years, weekly newsreel produced over so many decades. But one of my closest contacts in Cuba is Lola Calvino, who is the vice director of the Cinemateca, which holds the archive. And indeed, we talked about how to raise funds for digitizing the archive years and years ago. Never succeeded in doing it, but there was a plan. But eventually they were digitized. So the point is, I knew immediately that there was going to be all that material there, and sent Lola a list of the things that I was looking for after we'd worked through, with Gina and John and myself had worked through and produced a kind of rough script. And Lola pre-selected the material. So the first thing we did on arriving in Havana was to sit down and watch it and select it. And it contained some gems, of course, because things that, actually, you only find in an archive easily things which have been catalogued properly. And the catalogue, actually, I already had. So I knew that there were, an odd newsreel here or there, which actually even spoke of Kaibarin.
Interesting. I'm also wondering, how was the reception of the movie in Cuba itself? I suppose you showed it there as well, right? Was it different, or how was it perceived, in the area that it was shot? Any particular reaction or something that surprised you?
Well, first of all, we never got to show it in Kaibarin.
Oh, okay.
Not the finished film, first, right? But the process that we went through was a kind of adaptation to the circumstance of the idea of collaborative working. And that included not only, in the early stages of sharing the script with the people at the Fundación that we worked with, but also when we had a rough cut of the film, taking it back to Havana and showing it to them, getting their feedback, and then proceeding to the fine cut. So that's what we did, and the reception at that point was, rich in discussion and quite a lot of little points of feedback, significant points of feedback. And we were able to show it to just 2 or 3 people from Kaibarin. So we had the sense that we were on the right lines. And then we had one screening in Havana in December 2019 during the film festival, although not formally part of it. And that was, I was happy with the reception of the film. It raised interesting questions. Since then, I think one of the striking things with the online screenings we've had and other bits of feedback is the way that people relate the circumstances they see on the screen to circumstances that they know of in their own countries. So people in Britain, for example, immediately think about the rising sea level. And somebody in Spain immediately thinks about those parts of Spain which are awash with tourism. And somebody in Argentina thinks about a small abandoned town in the Pampas. So in that sense, the reception of the film outside Cuba, shows, I think, some continuity with the initial reception where the Cubans were recognizing themselves. But that recognition passes over into wider audiences in other ways.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I mean, in my case in the UK, of course, I only have to think about, or Michael's as well, I only have to think about towns in the north that were once mining towns, or in South Wales that, you know, really suffered over the last 30, 40 years, or seaside towns that went into decline. But one of our hopes, and it's still mine, I think I speak for all of us on the team, is that we will show the documentary round Cuba. Well, if not us, personally, the three of us who are the British component, that the foundation, if not the Film Institute, will sort of galvanize its network of environmentalists around the island, and it will be a discussion point. That hasn't happened because of COVID. It couldn't happen because Cuba's connectivity is such that you can't really do online screenings, and people couldn't travel around anyway because they were in some form of lockdown, and towns across the island were in it and out of it, so that wasn't possible. But it's going to be interesting going forward to see whether or not that happens. Michael was being very diplomatic at this point, but we ran into difficulties filming in Kaibarin. It was a point when film legislation was changing. They introduced a new decree about independent film just the month, few days before we arrived, sort of thing. You still had to have the permission of the Film Institute, which we had, and we had the stamp and the signature and everything. Off we went to Kaibarin, and they hadn't been informed by the correct channels. So they said, no, you can't film. After we'd been filming a few days anyway. So we do have footage, and we had historical footage, and we'd been working with a local environmental activist. He'd given us lots of material as well, who appears in the documentary, as does Reynaldo Funes, who's the historian, probably the leading environmental historian in Cuba at the moment. So it was the disconnect. Oh, the other thing that was happening was that there was change at the national level between powers at the local level, powers at the provincial level, and powers at the national level. So everybody was being very super cautious and not wanting to tread on toes or break eggshells. And there was another really interesting scenario that we knew nothing about until afterwards, which was that Kaibarin resents the fact that Remedios has been given resources that they haven't been given. So they're at loggerheads with the province, and and so the story goes on. We will never know all the ins and outs, but we have colleagues down the island who say, oh, it's a similar situation between Bayamo and Manzanillo, or, these things were beyond our control. But it made for a very interesting film shoot, I have to say. The other thing I might chip in is the debates that, Oliver, you might sympathize with this on one level, as a political scientist, but you had two historians working with a filmmaker. And although neither of us have a linear approach to history, we were kind of looking for the narrative. And we had to, we had to be convinced by Michael that there was a narrative emerging out of a sort of semi-eclecticism of the way the narrative was going. And all credit to Michael that he stuck to his guns, and we have the documentary.
I think there is a very compelling narrative, you know, that you develop in this movie, and I'm sure you have lots of stories still to share about your experience on the ground and how you did this. And maybe that has to wait, you know, probably has to wait now, you know, until, gee, maybe you'll be back, or Michael, you have the honors of visiting us on the west coast of Canada. But, you know, congratulations on your movie. And before I close, however, Rod asked whether you know of any NGOs or international organizations that could support those that are working directly and effectively to promote local remediation and ecological tourism in Cuba. So if anything comes to mind, Gina and Michael, you know, if you have any suggestions, send us to us, Stephanie or myself, and we will include it in our newsletter on the weekend, on Friday. So if you have any particular organization that you think could greatly benefit from support, let us know. But, you know, because it seems definitely an uphill battle, right? And, you know, you feel for Cuba and the environmental cause. And I think that came out in Fidel Castro's speech, right? You know, here you have this island that is not really majorly responsible for climate change, but bears the brunt of its effects on the ground, right? And I think, you know, the effects will be with Cubans for the decades to come, and it will be a major challenge, right, to address some of those economically and socially responsibly. So with this, you know, we've come to the point at which we have to say goodbye. Gina and Michael, thank you so much for taking the time today and sharing this fabulous documentary with us. Many thanks, and we make this recording also and the discussion available. Hopefully it will entice more people to watch your film, because I really think it deserves a big audience. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Oliver.
Goodbye to you in Britain. Hope you're doing well and come out of this pandemic well. And you know, we will see each other not too far into the future.
Okay.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.